Baby girl discovered a German shepherd locked in an old attic. What happened next touched everyone. What you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's a moment in time that will stay with you forever. A moment that tested the strength of a child, the loyalty of a dog, and the fragile line between tragedy and triumph. This isn't fiction. It happened. And it might just change the way you see the world. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This story deserves to be heard. The storm had rolled in heavy that evening, wrapping the old farmhouse in sheets of rain and rattling wind that seemed determined to break through every crack. The wooden walls groaned, the windows trembled, and the roof carried a tired echo with every strike of thunder. Inside, the air was dim, the lamps flickering in protest, and shadows stretched across the floor as though they were alive. The house had stood for generations, and it carried all the weight of its years in that storm. 4-year-old Lily sat curled on the faded couch, her little frame wrapped in a quilt her grandmother had stitched long ago. Her eyes, wide and curious, flicked to the windows every time lightning cut the sky open. She was visiting her grandmother for the week, a visit meant to bring joy and warmth, but the farmhouse felt too large, too filled with corners she didn't know. For Lily, it was a place of secrets. Her grandmother, Mrs. Harper, shuffled softly around the kitchen. She was steady, humming an old tune, her hands moving with the patience of age as she prepared tea. She wanted to keep the little girl calm. "It's just the storm, darling," she said, her voice gentle and practiced. "Old houses like this make plenty of noise when the wind shakes them." But Lily sat straighter, her small head turning upward toward the ceiling. The storm's noise was strong, but something else had found its way to her ears. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the groan of wood. It was smaller, softer. It came like a whisper hidden in the beams of the house, fragile as a sigh. She whispered back, almost afraid of her own words. "Nana, someone is up there." Her grandmother stopped stirring. "Up where, sweetheart?" Lily raised a tiny finger to the ceiling, her blue eyes round with certainty. "In the attic." Mrs. Harper's heart sank for a moment. That attic had not been touched in years. Dust lay thick there, trunks of forgotten clothes, broken furniture, memories too heavy to be disturbed. She shook her head and smiled a tired smile. "That old attic is empty, Lily. Just the wind playing tricks." But Lily was not convinced. Children hear what adults try to ignore. Her chest rose quickly, her little hand clutching the quilt, eyes refusing to leave the ceiling. The storm outside thundered, and then it came again, so faint her grandmother almost doubted herself. It wasn't the house. It wasn't the storm. It was a sound no storm could carry. A whimper, weak and trembling, the sound of something alive. Mrs. Harper set the spoon down, her breath caught. She knew her granddaughter was not imagining it. Slowly, she moved toward the narrow staircase at the back of the hall. Lily slid down from the couch, her bare feet padding softly on the wooden floor, and followed without a word. The stairs creaked under each step, the railing worn smooth by time. The flashlight in Mrs. Harper's hand cut through dust and darkness, and Lily's little fingers clutched the edge of her grandmother's dress as they climbed. At the top, the attic door loomed, paint chipped and peeling. A heavy iron lock clung to it, rusted but firm, as though it had been waiting years to be noticed. The silence was thick now, broken only by the storm and the faint sound from within. Dust swirled in the flashlight beam, and then, like a breath from the other side, the cry came again. Mrs. Harper's hands shook as she fumbled with the ring of keys she kept tied in her apron pocket. Her eyes narrowed, searching for the right one. She tried to steady her breath, but her heart raced. She had almost found the key when she turned and saw her granddaughter standing before the door. Lily's small hand, trembling but fearless, was already resting on the cold lock. The key turned with a heavy scrape, breaking through the years of silence that had sealed the attic. The old lock gave way at last, and the door groaned open as if it were unhappy to let anyone in. Dust rushed out in a cloud, carrying the smell of forgotten wood, paper, and time. The faint light from Mrs. Harper's flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing old trunks stacked against the walls, broken chairs, and boxes that hadn't been touched in decades. The air was heavy, still, like a room that had been waiting too long for someone to notice it again. Lily clutched her grandmother's hand, her little eyes wide as the beam of light shook across the space. For a moment it seemed like nothing was there but shadows and dust. But then, there it was. In the far corner, beyond the piles of boxes, something shifted. Two glowing eyes reflected the light back at them, soft but sharp, fixed on the intruders who had dared to open the door. Mrs. Harper gasped and pulled Lily slightly closer to her side, her breath catching in her throat. The eyes blinked, and as the light steadied, the shape became clear. A German shepherd, his body thin, fur matted and dull, sat trembling in the corner. His ribs showed through his sides, his ears drooped, and he was tied with a rope that looked old and frayed. An empty metal bowl lay on its side, streaked with dirt. The dog didn't bark, didn't growl, didn't move except for the tremor that ran through his frame. He was too weak for noise, too tired for fight. "Oh my heavens," Mrs. Harper whispered, pressing a hand to her mouth. Guilt and shock washed over her in a wave. How long has he been here? Her mind raced with questions, with disbelief. She lived here, how could she not have known? But the house was old, the attic rarely touched, and storms often drowned out the small sounds of life. The thought that this creature had been up here, surviving alone, left her heart heavy with sorrow. But Lily wasn't thinking about how or why. Her little heart only saw what was in front of her, a pair of lonely eyes that seemed to beg for kindness. She pulled free of her grandmother's hand and stepped forward, her small shoes crunching against the dusty floor. "Sweetheart, wait," Mrs. Harper whispered sharply, reaching for her. "Don't, he might." But Lily moved with the innocence only a child could have. She crouched low, her dress brushing against the dust, and stretched her tiny hand out. Her voice was soft, barely above a whisper. "It's okay," she said, as though the dog could understand. "We found you." The shepherd's eyes followed her hand. For a second he froze, too weak to move. Then, slowly, his tail gave the faintest wag. Not strong, not certain, but enough. A sign that somewhere inside the weakness, trust still lived. Mrs. Harper's heart twisted. The dog hadn't bitten, hadn't snarled. Instead, it seemed to recognize the gentleness in the child, the sincerity in her voice. The grandmother knelt down beside her, moving slower, carefully. She spoke low and steady, her voice trembling with compassion. "Easy now, we're not here to hurt you." She pulled the flashlight closer and saw the raw patch on his neck where the rope rubbed his skin. The dog lowered his head as if ashamed, though shame belonged to whoever had left him there. His body was shivering, but his eyes never left the little girl. Mrs. Harper carefully reached into her pocket, pulled out a small bottle of water she brought up with her, and poured some into the empty bowl. The sound of water seemed to awaken something in the shepherd. He stirred, his nose twitching, and with a weak effort, crawled forward. He dipped his tongue into the bowl, lapping desperately. Drops spilled onto the dusty floor, but the relief in his eyes was unmistakable. "That's it, good boy," Mrs. Harper whispered. She dared to place her hand on his head, stroking gently between his ears. The fur was rough, dirty, but the dog leaned into the touch, his eyes closing for a moment of peace he hadn't felt in so long. Lily giggled softly, the sound light and innocent in the heavy attic. "See, Nana? Is nice. He just needed us." She reached out again, her fingers brushing against the shepherd's paw. This time, he didn't pull away. He nudged her hand with his nose, a tired but trusting gesture. For the first time in what felt like forever, the shepherd didn't feel invisible. He wasn't locked away, unseen, unheard. Through the eyes of a little girl, he was seen. Through the kindness of her hand, he was touched. And in that moment, the attic was no longer just a room of dust and broken things. It was the beginning of something new. Mrs. Harper swallowed hard, blinking back the sting of tears. "We're taking him out of here," she said firmly, though her voice shook. She untied the old rope from the beam, her hands working quickly, her heart beating faster. The shepherd didn't resist. He only leaned into the child again, as though he had already chosen where his trust belonged. Together, they helped him to his unsteady feet. He wobbled, weak, but managed to walk with them toward the door. Every step was slow, but every step was closer to safety, closer to warmth, closer to love. As they guided him down the narrow stairs, the storm outside still roared. But inside, something had shifted. The house no longer felt like it was groaning in sadness. It felt like it was breathing with relief. For the first time in years, the attic had given up its secret, and in doing so, it had given them a chance to heal something broken. And for the German shepherd, tired, thin, forgotten, this was the first moment he felt safe again. Not because he was free, but because a child had looked at him and said without words, "You matter." The German shepherd stumbled as his paws touched the hallway floor, his legs shaking as though they had forgotten how to carry him. Mrs. Harper kept one steady hand on the rope, guiding him gently, while little Lily walked right by his side, her small hand resting on his back as if to promise he wasn't alone. Each step down the narrow stairs creaked louder than the last, the storm outside hammering at the windows, but inside there was a strange silence, a hush of wonder and disbelief. At the bottom, the dog hesitated, sniffing the air of the kitchen. It was warm here, filled with the smell of bread and tea, a world away from the cold attic. Still, his ears were flat, his tail tucked low, his eyes darting nervously as though he feared he'd be shoved back into the shadows again. "It's all right, boy," Mrs. Harper said softly, lowering herself so he wouldn't feel so threatened. "No one's going to hurt you now." Lily, her face glowing with determination, tugged on the quilt from the couch and spread it on the floor like a royal carpet. "See? This is for him," she announced proudly. "He can sit here with us." The shepherd looked from the girl to the blanket, uncertain. His ribs rose and fell too quickly, his body stiff with years of fear. Yet when Lily sat down on the blanket herself, patting the space beside her, he seemed to understand. With a shaky breath, he lowered himself, his thin frame folding carefully onto the warmth she had offered. Mrs. Harper wasted no time. She moved quickly to the cupboard, pulling down a bowl, and filled it with warm milk. Beside it, she placed a small piece of bread, torn into gentle portions. She set it near the dog, her hand steady, her heart trembling. "There, sweetheart," she said. "You must be starving." The dog sniffed the bowl suspiciously at first, his body tense. But the smell was too much to resist. Slowly, cautiously, his tongue dipped into the milk. A small whimper escaped him, not of pain but of relief. He lapped greedily, gulping as though afraid it might vanish. Lily clapped her hands softly, eyes wide with joy. "He likes it, Nana. He's hungry." Mrs. Harper smiled, though her heart ached. "Of course he is. Poor thing, he's been alone far too long." When the bowl was empty, Lily grabbed a towel from the basket near the stove. She dragged it across the floor toward the shepherd, determination written across her tiny face. "He needs to be clean," she announced. "He's too dusty." Mrs. Harper chuckled softly but didn't stop her. She dampened the towel with warm water and wrung it out before handing it back. Lily reached forward carefully, dabbing at the dog's fur with gentle strokes. The shepherd flinched at first, his body stiff, but when he saw the softness in her eyes, he stayed still. Each wipe brushed away the dirt of loneliness, and his breathing began to slow. Mrs. Harper joined in, carefully drying his head and paws. "Who could have left you like this?" she murmured. "Tied up, forgotten, abandoned in the dark." She shook her head, grief welling inside her. "He must have belonged to someone before, Lily. Someone who didn't care enough to take him with them." But Lily shook her head firmly. "Not anymore. He's ours now." She pressed the towel against the shepherd's ear and whispered, "You're safe. You'll never be alone again." As though he understood, the shepherd lifted his head slightly, leaning it against her little hand. His eyes, still tired and haunted, softened just enough to let hope slip through. "Shadow," Lily said suddenly, her voice bright with discovery. Mrs. Harper glanced at her. "Shadow?" "Yes," Lily said with conviction, pointing at the dog. "Because he follows me. He's quiet like a shadow." She beamed at her grandmother, as though the name had always been waiting for him. Mrs. Harper let the name settle in the air. If it, a creature who had lived in the shadows, now pulled into the light by a child's love. "Shadow," she repeated softly, placing her hand on his head. "Yes, that suits him." Shadow shifted, curling himself closer to the little girl, his body pressing against the edge of her blanket as though he, too, had accepted the name. He let out a long sigh, one that sounded like release, like relief, like the first breath of freedom. The thunder rumbled outside, shaking the windows in their frames. The storm raged on, relentless and wild. But inside the kitchen, there was warmth. The flicker of the lamp painted soft gold across the walls, the smell of fresh bread mingled with the dampness of rain-soaked fur, and a little girl's laughter filled the space where silence had once lived. Lily yawned, her small body growing heavy with the comfort of the moment. She pulled the quilt up around her shoulders and leaned against Shadow. The shepherd lowered his head at her feet, his eyes closing, his body relaxing for the first time in what must have been years. He didn't tremble anymore. He didn't flinch. He simply rested, as if he had finally found the place he had been waiting for. Mrs. Harper stood quietly watching the two of them. The storm outside didn't matter anymore. In the glow of the kitchen, with the old farmhouse holding them close, something new had begun. A bond born in the most unexpected place. A dusty attic, a stormy night, and the soft heart of a child. For Shadow, the world had been dark and cruel. But now, with a name whispered in kindness and a blanket shared by tiny hands, he was no longer a prisoner of shadows. He had been seen, touched, and welcomed. And in that moment, a new story had begun, not of loneliness, but of belonging. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the farmhouse wrapped in a pale golden light. The air smelled of damp earth and clean rain, and the fields outside glistened with droplets clinging to every blade of grass. Inside, the kitchen felt warmer than usual, the smell of fresh bread still hanging in the air. Shadow lay curled on the quilt near the hearth, his breathing slow and steady, his chest rising with the kind of peace that comes only after long suffering. Lily stirred first, rubbing her eyes as she peeked down at the shepherd at her feet. The sight made her giggle softly. "He's still here," she whispered, as though she had half expected him to vanish like a dream. She slid down, her small hand instantly finding the dog's fur. Shadow lifted his head and thumped his tail weakly, a greeting reserved only for her. Mrs. Harper, watching from the stove, sipped her tea and shook her head in quiet wonder. "He trusts you, child," she murmured. "More than I've seen any dog trust so quickly." But her brow furrowed with worry. "Still, he's weak. We need to see the vet today. He deserves a chance at a healthy life." So it was that a few hours later, The old truck rattled down the country road, the farmhouse shrinking behind them. Shadow lay in the back seat, his body trembling not from fear now, but from uncertainty. He pressed his head against Lily's lap, drawing comfort from her presence. The little girl stroked his ears, whispering promises only he seemed to understand. The town's vet clinic sat on the corner of Main Street, a small white building with peeling paint but a kind heart inside. Dr. Myers, a man with graying hair and gentle eyes, welcomed them the moment they walked through the door. His voice was calm, steady, the kind that made animals relax even before he touched them. "Well, what do we have here?" he said softly, crouching down to meet Shadow's tired gaze. "You've had a rough time, haven't you, boy?" The examination was simple but thorough. Dr. Myers listened to his heartbeat, checked his eyes, teeth, and paws, and ran careful hands down his thin body. He shook his head, sadness filling his voice. "Malnourished. Very weak. He's been neglected for a long time." Lily's face tightened with worry. Is he going to be okay?" Dr. Myers smiled gently at her, his hands still resting on Shadow's back. "With love and care, he's a fighter. He just needs good food, warmth, and time." He glanced up at Mrs. Harper. "He's lucky you found him. Another week, maybe two," and he didn't finish the sentence, but the weight of it hung in the air. Mrs. Harper pressed her lips together and nodded. "Then we'll give him everything he needs. No creature deserves to fade away in silence." It was then that Dr. Myers noticed the worn collar around Shadow's neck. He frowned and leaned closer, brushing away the dirt crusted into the leather. "Curious," he murmured. "I almost missed this." He held it to the light, and faintly, barely visible, were small engravings. 2 initials, carved long ago, weathered but still there. "Looks like he belonged to someone once," the vet said. "Maybe a farm nearby or a family that left. These letters, they could help us trace him back." Mrs. Harper's heart sank at the thought. She glanced at her granddaughter, knowing what the little one's reaction would be. Sure enough, Lily shook her head firmly, her voice breaking the silence. "No," she said, her tiny arms wrapping around Shadow's neck. "He's ours now. He chose us. I found him." Dr. Myers softened at the sight. "I understand, sweetheart. Sometimes bonds are stronger than any record or engraving." He patted her shoulder kindly. "But it might be good to know where he came from. Dogs carry stories too." Lily buried her face in Shadow's fur. "His story starts here now. With me." Her words were simple, but the weight of them filled the room. Loyalty, pure and unshaken, burned brighter than any law. Shadow, as though he understood, leaned into her embrace. His eyes closed, his body relaxing completely for the first time during the visit. It was as if he knew he didn't have to fear being taken away, not as long as that little girl's arms held him. Mrs. Harper's eyes welled with quiet tears. Children had a way of cutting through the world's complications with the truth adults often forgot. Papers, names, old scars, they didn't matter to Lily. What mattered was the promise she had made with her small heart, that he would never be left alone again. Dr. Myers sighed and gave a small smile. "Then Shadow it is. He's yours now, and I think he knows it too. Just take care of him, and he'll give you more than you can imagine in return." As they left the clinic, Mrs. Harper carried the weight of the discovery. Those faint initials on the collar tugged at her thoughts. Who had left him? Why had he been abandoned in that attic? There was a story hidden there, one she couldn't yet see, but she felt it pressing at the edges of her mind. In the truck, Lily hummed softly, her arms wrapped tight around her dog. The storm clouds had broken, sunlight spilling across the fields, but inside the vehicle the glow came from something deeper. A child's loyalty. A dog's silent gratitude. Shadow's story wasn't finished, far from it. The collar whispered of a past, of secrets buried in dust and silence. But for now, the road ahead held warmth, healing, and a bond stronger than any chain. The attic looked different in the daylight. The storm had passed, and beams of soft morning sun slipped through the small round window at the far end. Dust floated lazily in the air, turning golden in the light. What had once felt like a dark prison now felt like a place full of secrets, waiting to be uncovered. Mrs. Harper tied a scarf around her head, broom in hand, while little Lily followed behind her with a small duster that seemed much too big for her tiny hands. Shadow sat at the bottom of the attic stairs, watching with quiet eyes, his ears pricked as if he, too, knew this room carried pieces of his story. "Careful, sweetheart," Mrs. Harper said, lifting a box that had sagged under the weight of years. "These things are older than me." She chuckled softly, though her laugh carried a touch of sadness. Lily pushed aside a pile of fabric and sneezed as the dust puffed into the air. "Nana, why are there so many boxes?" she asked, her voice echoing faintly against the slanted walls. "Because houses hold memories," Mrs. Harper replied gently. "Every box is something someone wanted to keep." She paused, setting down the broom to open one of the boxes. Inside were yellowed letters tied with ribbon, old china plates carefully wrapped, and a stack of photographs curled at the edges. Lily picked one up carefully, holding it with both hands. Her eyes widened. "Nana, look," she whispered. In the faded picture stood a man, tall and proud, smiling in front of the very same farmhouse. And right by his side was a dog, strong, bright, his fur shiny and thick. A German shepherd. Mrs. Harper's breath caught. She held the photograph closer, her fingers tracing the outline of the man's hand resting on the shepherd's head. "I'll be," she murmured. "That's him. That's our shadow." The dog, hearing his name, lifted his head from the stair and gave a faint thump of his tail. He didn't know about photographs or memories, but something in the room had shifted, and he could sense it. Mrs. Harper's voice softened, full of recognition. "I remember now. Mr. Harris. He lived here before us years ago. He had a dog he loved more than anything, loyal, always by his side. Folks in town used to talk about them." Lily's eyes sparkled with excitement. "So Shadow had a person before?" "Yes, sweetheart," her grandmother said, her voice heavy with both warmth and sorrow. "But when Mr. Harris passed away, his family packed up and left. This house stood empty for years. And it seems," she trailed off, glancing toward the shepherd's tired body at the stair. "It seems they left him too." The weight of the truth pressed against them both. Lily looked back down at the picture, then at the dog. Her little face crumpled, her eyes welling with tears. "He waited," she whispered, her lip trembling. "He was waiting all this time, and nobody came." Mrs. Harper knelt beside her, pulling her close. "Yes, darling. He waited because that's what loyal hearts do. They don't give up even when the world forgets them." For a long moment, the attic was silent except for the faint creak of the old house. Then Lily slid out of her grandmother's embrace and padded over to Shadow. She knelt, wrapping her arms around his neck, her cheek pressed against his fur. The dog closed his eyes, leaning into her, as if he had been waiting for this promise. "I'll never let him be alone again," she said fiercely, her little voice trembling with both sadness and determination. "Never. He's ours now. He's my shadow forever." Mrs. Harper's throat tightened, and she brushed a tear from her cheek. She thought of all the years the shepherd had spent in silence, trapped between memory and abandonment. And now here he was, found by a child's innocence, given a future that might finally heal the long, empty waiting. As the day wore on, the attic grew cleaner. Dusty furniture was shifted, old boxes stacked neatly, and photographs gathered carefully into a basket. But the picture of Mr. Harris and his shepherd sat on the kitchen table that night, framed by the glow of a small lamp. Shadow lay curled beneath it, no longer a ghost of the past, but part of a living story. Outside, the wind still moved through the fields, carrying whispers of things gone. Inside, warmth filled every corner. The girl, the grandmother, and the dog had turned a house of memories into a home again. And though the collar around Shadow's neck still carried secrets, though the faint initials still raised questions, the promise in Lily's voice had given him what no paper or name ever could: belonging. The knock on the door came just as the sun was setting, painting the farmhouse in orange and gold. Mrs. Harper had written a letter days earlier after finding the old photograph in the attic. She had traced it through neighbors, and then to a woman who lived only 2 towns over. Tonight, that woman had arrived. Her name was Margaret Harris, daughter of the man in the photograph. When Mrs. Harper opened the door, the woman stood there with cautious eyes, her coat still smelling of travel. Behind her, the field stretched into dusk. Shadow padded to the threshold, his steps slow but steady. The moment Margaret's eyes fell on him, she froze. Her hand rose to her mouth, and tears spilled down her cheeks before she could even speak. "Max," she whispered. "Oh my God." Her voice cracked as she stumbled forward, falling to her knees right on the porch. Shadow stopped, tilted his head, and sniffed at her trembling hands. For a moment he seemed confused, caught between a memory long buried and the present before him. Then Margaret buried her face in his fur, sobbing into his neck. "We thought we lost you. We searched everywhere. Years ago, when we moved, you were gone. We thought you slipped out, that something terrible happened. You were just gone." Mrs. Harper's eyes softened with both relief and sorrow. She hadn't known what the woman's reaction would be, but now it was clear. This dog had once been loved. "So he was yours," she said quietly. Margaret nodded, her tears falling fast. "Yes, he was ours. My father called him Max. They were inseparable. After Dad passed, everything was chaos. We packed too quickly, too carelessly. Max must have hidden somewhere in the house, scared of the noise and boxes. We searched, but the movers were impatient. We left thinking he'd bolted, thinking maybe he was gone forever." Shadow's ears twitched at the name Max, but his body stayed close to the little girl behind him. Lily had been watching quietly from the kitchen doorway, her hands clutching her blanket. She stepped forward now, her eyes bright but worried. "His name is Shadow," she said firmly, almost defensively. "He's mine. He chose me." The woman's gaze lifted, red-rimmed and heavy with emotion. She looked at the child, then at the dog who stood protectively in front of her. For a long moment, the farmhouse was wrapped in silence, broken only by the sound of Shadow's steady breathing. Mrs. Harper's voice trembled as she spoke. "This is what I feared. Do we return him to his past, or let him stay where he's found peace again?" Margaret wiped her eyes, her gaze still fixed on the shepherd. She saw how he leaned into the little girl's side, how his tail thumped softly when her hand touched his back. The bond was plain, strong as steel. Her lips quivered as she whispered, "He loved my father more than anyone. And when my father was gone, maybe he was meant to find someone new." She paused, taking a deep breath. Maybe he was waiting for her. Lily crouched down and wrapped both arms tightly around Shadow's neck. Her voice was small but unshaken. "He doesn't want to leave me. I'll never let him be alone again. Never." Margaret's tears returned, but this time they carried a gentler weight. She reached out, resting her hand on Lily's shoulder. "Sweetheart," she said softly, "if he chose you, then this is his home now. My father would have wanted him safe, wanted him loved. And it's clear he's found both with you." Mrs. Harper let out the breath she'd been holding, her shoulders sagging with relief. She hadn't realized how much she had been dreading this moment until it passed. Shadow pressed closer to Lily, his tail swishing across the wooden floor. His eyes no longer darted between the past and present. They stayed fixed on the child who had brought him back to life. Margaret smiled through her tears, bending low to kiss the shepherd's head. "Goodbye, Max," she whispered, though there was no sadness in her voice anymore, only peace. She straightened, wiping her cheeks. "Hello, Shadow. Take care of her. You belong here now." The farmhouse grew quiet after she left, but the weight that lingered was not sorrow. It was something else, something deeper, a blessing, a closing of an old door and the opening of a new one. Shadow had been Max once, a loyal friend to another family. But now he was Shadow, a guardian to a little girl whose love had pulled him out of silence and fear. That night, as the storm clouds drifted far from the valley, Lily curled up with her dog at her side. She whispered into his ear, her voice soft but strong. "See? You don't have to wait anymore. You're home." And for the first time in years, Shadow slept without stirring, safe in the arms of a family that would never let him be forgotten again. Days turned into weeks, and the shadow that once haunted the old attic slowly turned into light. Shadow's ribs, once sharp and hollow, began to fade under a healthier coat of fur. His steps grew steadier, no longer trembling from weakness but firm with new strength. Every morning he would trot after Lily as she skipped across the kitchen tiles, his tail brushing against her legs like a silent reminder that he was always there. The farmhouse itself seemed to shift with his presence. Where once silence lingered heavy in the halls, now laughter began to return. Lily, who had carried her own quiet sadness for so long, found her voice again. She laughed when Shadow chased her small red ball across the yard. She giggled when his wet nose poked into her hair. And she spoke, simple words at first, then stories, then songs. Her grandmother often paused in the doorway, hand pressed to her chest, watching the two of them spin around the yard in circles of joy she thought she'd never see again. At night, Shadow became more than just a playmate. He was a protector. He would lie at the foot of Lily's bed, his head resting on his paws, one ear always pricked for any sound. Sometimes, when Lily stirred in her sleep, Shadow would rise quietly and nudge her with his nose, as if assuring her that the nightmares couldn't reach her anymore. Mrs. Harper, watching from the door one evening, whispered through her tears, "He knows. He knows she needs him." The dog's instincts seemed to stretch beyond the ordinary. On the days Lily forgot her small medicine by the bedside, Shadow would nudge the bottle gently toward her grandmother, as if to remind them of what was needed. He had become more than a rescued soul. He had become a guardian woven into the fabric of their days. The neighbors began to notice the change too. At first, they came by only to bring casseroles or lend tools, but soon they lingered at the fence, watching the little girl run with her shepherd across the meadow. They whispered among themselves about how thin and broken the dog had once looked, and now, how he stood tall again, his coat gleaming under the sun. For many of them, Shadow became more than just a dog. He became a story, a living reminder that healing was possible, that even the forgotten could find their place again. Children who had once been afraid of the big old farmhouse now came running to the gate, hoping for a chance to throw a stick or pat Shadow's head. Their parents, smiling, remarked to Mrs. Harper, "He's become part of the town, hasn't he? A symbol of hope." For Lily, though, the bond went deeper than anyone else could see. It showed in the small moments, in the way she whispered secrets into his ear as though he understood every word, in the way she slipped pieces of her toast under the table for him to catch, in the way her hand always seemed to find his fur whenever she felt shy or uncertain. And then came the day when Lily's healing shone brighter than ever. The attic door, once a place of fear, still loomed at the top of the stairs. She had avoided it since that stormy night, her eyes always glancing away when she passed. But one afternoon, with sunlight spilling through the windows, she stopped at the base of the steps. Shadow was beside her, his eyes steady, his tail giving a single reassuring thump. Her grandmother paused, watching closely as Lily placed a small foot on the first stair. Her hand shook, but she gripped the rail tight. Shadow climbed one step beside her, his body brushing against her leg, anchoring her. Step by step, she went higher until she stood before the old attic door. The key still hung on its hook nearby, but she didn't need it. She placed her palm on the wood, closed her eyes, and whispered, "I'm not afraid anymore. Shadow is with me." The words carried like a song through the quiet house, soft yet strong, and Mrs. Harper felt tears sting her eyes. In that moment, the attic was no longer a place of darkness. It was a reminder of how far they had come, of the fear that had been broken by loyalty and love. That night, as Lily drifted to sleep with Shadow curled at her side, Mrs. Harper sat by the window, looking out at the stars. She thought of all the twists of fate that had led to this bond. The storm, the attic, the photograph, the woman who had let Shadow go. And she realized that sometimes healing didn't come in one grand moment but in the small, steady beats of daily life. In laughter returning, in voices rising, in a dog's eyes that finally looked at peace. The farmhouse felt different now, as if its very walls had begun to breathe easier. What had once been heavy with silence was now alive with voices and warmth. One quiet afternoon, the dining table was set with a simple tea, Mrs. Harper's porcelain cups, Lily's favorite biscuits, and a vase of fresh flowers from the garden. Margaret Harris had joined them, her eyes still tender when they lingered on Shadow. She sat across from Lily, who fed the shepherd tiny crumbs under the table, giggling each time his warm nose brushed her palm. It was not the reunion Margaret had expected. She had come carrying grief, memories of a dog she thought had been lost forever. And yet, as she watched Shadow curl himself close to the little girl, she understood that he wasn't truly lost. He had only been waiting to be found by the right hands. "He looks happy," Margaret said softly, lifting her teacup. "I think my father would be at peace knowing he ended up here, loved like this." Mrs. Harper smiled gently, and Lily leaned over, pressing her cheek against Shadow's ear. Around his neck gleamed a new collar, strong and sturdy, its tag freshly engraved. Margaret had brought it with her, a small gift to mark the start of his new life. The silver tag caught the sunlight as Shadow lifted his head. "Shadow, forever home," it read. Lily tapped it proudly with her small fingers. "See? Now everyone knows he belongs here." Later that day, the three of them climbed to the attic together. But this time, there was no fear. The dust had been swept away, the broken furniture cleared. Curtains now covered the window, letting the afternoon sun spill across neatly arranged shelves and framed photographs. Where once there had been shadows, there was now warmth. The room was no longer a prison. It was a memory room, a place of stories. On one side, Margaret had placed the old photograph of her father with Max, while beside it sat a new frame, Lily with Shadow, his tired eyes bright again, both of them smiling as if the world outside didn't matter. Lily wandered to the center of the room and turned to face them, her little voice steady, carrying more weight than her years. "He wasn't locked away," she said softly, looking down at the shepherd who stood beside her. "He was waiting for us." The simplicity of her words stilled the room. Mrs. Harper felt her throat tighten as she placed a hand over her granddaughter's shoulder. "Yes, darling," she whispered. "Sometimes waiting is just another word for hope." She let her eyes drift over the attic, the place that had once felt like a wound. Now it had been healed by the love of a child. As they stood there, Margaret wiped at her eyes, though her smile never left. Mrs. Harper's voice grew tender, her words carrying the weight of a final truth. "Sometimes," she said, Children remind us that love is the strongest key of all. Stronger than fear, stronger than time. It can unlock even the darkest rooms. The sun dipped lower, spilling golden light across the wooden beams. Shadows lengthened gently across the floor, but they no longer carried dread, they carried peace. Downstairs, as the day gave way to evening, Lily carried Shadow out into the yard. They sat together on the porch steps, the world painted in the soft glow of sunset. The dog rested his head in her lap, his body finally still, his eyes closing not in exhaustion but in contentment. For the first time in years, he was home and safe and loved. The farmhouse stood tall against the sky, no longer just a house but a keeper of promises. In the quiet of the evening, Lily's soft humming drifted across the yard, mingling with the sound of crickets and the whisper of wind in the trees. Shadow's tail thumped once against the wooden step, a gentle echo of everything he could not say in words. And as the scene faded into twilight, the story found its truth. The attic had not been about dust or broken things, nor about a lock and a forgotten rope. It had been about waiting, about love that never gave up, about a child who had the courage to listen when others could not. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who still believes in loyalty that never fades.